The Lemesurier Inheritance. Agatha Christie wrote during a period when she was deeply exploring themes of fate and familial curses, which were common in Gothic literature. The story was first published in 1923, a time when Christie was solidifying her reputation as the Queen of Crime. This period was marked by her interest in psychological depth, particularly the concept of inherited guilt and the influence of family legacies on individual destinies. The character of Hercule Poirot, with his logical and methodical approach, often served as a counterpoint to the superstitions and irrational beliefs prevalent in society, which is vividly reflected in this story. Agatha Christie, The Lemesurier Inheritance. In company with Poirot, I have investigated many strange cases, but none, I think, to compare with that extraordinary series of events which held our interest over a period of many years, and which culminated in the ultimate problem brought to Poirot to solve. Our attention was first drawn to the family history of the Lemesuriers one evening during the war. Poirot and I had but recently come together again, renewing the old days of our acquaintanceship in Belgium. He had been handling some little matter for the War Office, disposing of it to their entire satisfaction, and we had been dining at the Carlton with a brass hat who paid Poirot heavy compliments in the intervals of the meal. The brass hat had to rush away to keep an appointment with someone, and we finished our coffee in a leisurely fashion before following his example. As we were leaving the room, I was hailed by a voice which struck a familiar note, and turned to see Captain Vincent Lemesurier, a young fellow whom I had known in France. He was with an older man whose likeness to him proclaimed him to be of the same family. Such proved to be the case, and he was introduced to us as Mr. Hugo Lemesurier, uncle of my young friend. I did not really know Captain Lemesurier at all intimately, but he was a pleasant young fellow, somewhat dreamy in manner, and I remembered hearing that he belonged to an old and exclusive family with a property in Northumberland which dated from before the Reformation. Poirot and I were not in a hurry, and at the younger man's invitation, we sat down at the table with our two newfound friends, and chattered pleasantly enough on various matters. The elder Lemesurier was a man of about 40, with a touch of the scholar in his stooping shoulders. He was engaged at the moment upon some chemical research work for the government. It appeared. Our conversation was interrupted by a tall dark young man who strode up to the table, evidently laboring under some agitation of mind. "Thank goodness I've found you both," he exclaimed. "What's the matter, Roger?" "Your governor, Vincent. Bad fall. Young horse." The rest trailed off, as he drew the other aside. In a few minutes our two friends had hurriedly taken leave of us. Vincent Lemesurier's father had had a serious accident while trying a young horse, and was not expected to live until morning. Vincent had gone deadly white, and appeared almost stunned by the news. In a way, I was surprised, for from the few words he had let fall on the subject while in France, I had gathered that he and his father were not on particularly friendly terms, and so his display of filial feeling now rather astonished me. The dark young man, who had been introduced to us as a cousin, Mr. Roger Lemesurier, remained behind, and we three strolled out together. "Rather a curious business, this," observed the young man. "It would interest M. Poirot, perhaps. I've heard of you, you know, M. Poirot, from Higginson." Higginson was our brass hat friend. "He says you're a whale on psychology." "I study the psychology, yes," admitted my friend cautiously. "Did you see my cousin's face? He was absolutely bowled over, wasn't he? Do you know why? A good old-fashioned family curse. Would you care to hear about it? It would be most kind of you to recount it to me." Roger Lemesurier looked at his watch. "Lots of time. I'm meeting them at King's Cross." "Well, M. Poirot, the Lemesuriers are an old family. Way back in medieval times, a Lemesurier became suspicious of his wife. He found the lady in a compromising situation. She swore that she was innocent, but old Baron Hugo didn't listen. She had one child, a son, and he swore that the boy was no child of his and should never inherit. I forget what he did, some pleasing medieval fancy like walling up the mother and son alive. Anyway, he killed them both, and she died protesting her innocence and solemnly cursing the Lemesuriers forever. No firstborn son of a Lemesurier should ever inherit, so the curse ran. Well, time passed, and the lady's innocence was established beyond doubt. I believe that Hugo wore a hair shirt and ended up his days on his knees in a monk's cell. But the curious thing is that from that day to this, no firstborn son ever has succeeded to the estate. It's gone to brothers, to nephews, to second sons, never to the eldest son. Vincent's father was the second of 5 sons, the eldest of whom died in infancy. Of course, all through the war, Vincent has been convinced that whoever else was doomed, he certainly was. But strangely enough, his 2 younger brothers have been killed, and he himself has remained unscathed. An interesting family history, said Poirot thoughtfully, but now his father is dying, and he, as the eldest son, succeeds? Exactly. A curse has gone rusty, unable to stand the strain of modern life. Poirot shook his head, as though deprecating the other's jesting tone. Roger Lemesurier looked at his watch again, and declared that he must be off. The sequel to the story came on the morrow, when we learned of the tragic death of Captain Vincent Lemesurier. He had been traveling north by the Scotch mail train, and during the night must have opened the door of the compartment and jumped out on the line. The shock of his father's accident coming on top of the shell shock was deemed to have caused temporary mental aberration. The curious superstition prevalent in the Lemesurier family was mentioned, in connection with the new heir, his father's brother, Ronald Lemesurier, whose only son had died on the Somme. I suppose our accidental meeting with young Vincent on the last evening of his life quickened our interest in anything that pertained to the Lemesurier family. For we noted with some interest 2 years later the death of Ronald Lemesurier, who had been a confirmed invalid at the time of his succession to the family estates. His brother John succeeded him, a hale, hearty man with a boy at Eton. Certainly an evil destiny overshadowed the Lemesuriers. On his very next holiday the boy managed to shoot himself fatally. His father's death, which occurred quite suddenly after being stung by a wasp, gave the estate over to the youngest brother of the 5, Hugo, whom we remembered meeting on the fatal night at the Carlton. Beyond commenting on the extraordinary series of misfortunes which befell the Lemesuriers, we had taken no personal interest in the matter. But the time was now close at hand when we were to take a more active part. One morning Mrs. Lemesurier was announced. She was a tall, active woman, possibly about 30 years of age, who conveyed by her demeanor a great deal of determination and strong common sense. She spoke with a faint transatlantic accent. Poirot? I am pleased to meet you. My husband, Hugo Lemesurier, met you once many years ago, but you will hardly remember the fact. I recollect it perfectly, madam. It was at the Carlton. That's quite wonderful of you. Poirot, I'm very worried. What about, madam? My elder boy. I've 2 boys, you know, Ronald's 8, and Gerald's 6. Proceed, madam, why should you be worried about little Ronald? Poirot, within the last 6 months he has had 3 narrow escapes from death, once from drowning, when we were all down at Cornwall this summer, once when he fell from the nursery window, and once from ptomaine poisoning. Perhaps Poirot's face expressed rather too eloquently what he thought, for Mrs. Lemesurier hurried on with hardly a moment's pause. Of course I know you think I'm just a silly fool of a woman, making mountains out of molehills. No, indeed, madam, any mother might be excused for being upset at such occurrences, but I hardly see where I can be of any assistance to you. I am not le bon Dieu to control the waves. For the nursery window I should suggest some iron bars, and for the food, what can equal a mother's care? But why should these things happen to Ronald and not to Gerald? The chance, madam, le hazard. You think so? What do you think, madam, you and your husband? A shadow crossed Mrs. Lemesurier's face. It's no good going to Hugo, he won't listen. As perhaps you may have heard, there's supposed to be a curse on the family. No eldest son can succeed. Hugo believes in it. He's wrapped up in the family history, and he's superstitious to the last degree. When I go to him with my fears, he just says it's the curse. And we can't escape it. But I'm from the States, Poirot, and over there we don't believe much in curses. We like them as belonging to a real high-toned old family. It gives a sort of cachet, don't you know? I was just a musical comedy actress in a small part when Hugo met me, and I thought his family curse was just too lovely for words. That kind of thing's all right for telling round the fire on a winter's evening, but when it comes to one's own children, I just adore my children, Poirot. I'd do anything for them. So you decline to believe in the family legend, madam? Can a legend saw through an ivy stem? What is that you are saying, madam? Cried Poirot. An expression of great astonishment on his face. I said, can a legend, or a ghost, if you like to call it that, saw through an ivy stem? I'm not saying anything about Cornwall. Any boy might go out too far and get into difficulties, though Ronald could swim when he was 4 years old. But the ivy's different. Both the boys were very naughty. They'd discovered they could climb up and down by the ivy. They were always doing it. One day, Gerald was away at the time, Ronald did it once too often, and the ivy gave way and he fell. Fortunately he didn't damage himself seriously, but I went out and examined the ivy. It was cut through, Poirot, deliberately cut through. It is very serious what you are telling me there, madam. You say your younger boy was away from home at the moment? Yes. And at the time of the ptomaine poisoning, was he still away? No, they were both there. Curious, murmured Poirot. Now, madam, who are the inmates of your establishment? Miss Saunders, the children's governess, and John Gardiner, my husband's secretary. Mrs. Lemesurier paused, as though slightly embarrassed. And who else, madam? Major Roger Lemesurier, whom you also met on that night, I believe, stays with us a good deal. Ah, yes, he is a cousin, is he not? A distant cousin. He does not belong to our branch of the family. Still, I suppose now he is my husband's nearest relative. He is a dear fellow, and we are all very fond of him. The boys are devoted to him. It was not he who taught them to climb up the ivy? It might have been. He incites them to mischief often enough. Madam, I apologize for what I said to you earlier. The danger is real, and I believe that I can be of assistance. I propose that you should invite us both to stay with you. Your husband will not object? Oh no. But he will believe it to be all of no use. It makes me furious the way he just sits around and expects the boy to die. Calm yourself, madam. Let us make our arrangements methodically. Our arrangements were duly made. And the following day saw us flying northward. Poirot was sunk in a reverie. He came out of it, to remark abruptly, it was from a train such as this that Vincent Lemesurier fell? He put a slight accent on the fell. You don't suspect foul play there, surely? I asked. Has it struck you, Hastings, that some of the Lemesurier deaths were, shall we say, capable of being arranged? Take that of Vincent, for instance. Then the Eton boy, an accident with a gun is always ambiguous. Supposing this child had fallen from the nursery window and been dashed to death, what more natural and unsuspicious? But why only the one child, Hastings? Who profits by the death of the elder child? His younger brother. A child of 7. Absurd. They mean to do away with the other later, I suggested, though with the vaguest ideas as to who they were. Poirot shook his head as though dissatisfied. Ptomaine poisoning, he mused. Atropine will produce much the same symptoms. Yes, there is need for our presence. Mrs. Lemesurier welcomed us enthusiastically. Then she took us to her husband's study and left us with him. He had changed a good deal since I saw him last. His shoulders stooped more than ever, and his face had a curious pale grey tinge. He listened while Poirot explained our presence in the house, how exactly like Sadie's practical common sense. He said at last, "Remain by all means. Poirot, and I thank you for coming, but, what is written, is written. The way of the transgressor is hard. We Lemesuriers know, none of us can escape the doom." Poirot mentioned the sawn through ivy, but Hugo seemed very little impressed. Doubtless some careless gardener. Yes, there may be an instrument, but the purpose behind is plain, and I will tell you this, Poirot, it cannot be long delayed. Poirot looked at him attentively. Why do you say that? Because I myself am doomed. I went to a doctor last year. I am suffering from an incurable disease. The end cannot be much longer delayed, but before I die, Ronald will be taken. Gerald will inherit. And if anything were to happen to your second son also? Nothing will happen to him, he is not threatened. But if it did, persisted Poirot. My cousin Roger is the next heir. We were interrupted. A tall man with a good figure and crispy curling auburn hair entered with a sheaf of papers. Never mind about those now, Gardiner, said Hugo Lemesurier, then he added, my secretary, Mr. Gardiner. The secretary bowed, uttered a few pleasant words and then went out. In spite of his good looks, there was something repellent about the man. I said so to Poirot shortly afterward when we were walking round the beautiful old grounds together, and rather to my surprise. He agreed. Yes, Hastings, you are right. I do not like him. He is too good-looking. He would be one for the soft job always. Ah, here are the children. Mrs. Lemesurier was advancing towards us, her 2 children beside her. They were fine-looking boys, the younger dark like his mother, the elder with auburn curls. They shook hands prettily enough, and were soon absolutely devoted to Poirot. We were next introduced to Miss Saunders, a nondescript female, who completed the party. For some days we had a pleasant, easy existence, ever vigilant, but without result. The boys led a happy normal life and nothing seemed to be amiss. On the 4th day after our arrival Major Roger Lemesurier came down to stay. He was little changed, still carefree and debonair as of old, with the same habit of treating all things lightly. He was evidently a great favorite with the boys, who greeted his arrival with shrieks of delight and immediately dragged him off to play wild Indians in the garden. I noticed that Poirot followed them unobtrusively. On the following day we were all invited to tea, boys included, with Lady Claygate, whose place adjoined that of the Lemesuriers. Mrs. Lemesurier suggested that we also should come, but seemed rather relieved when Poirot refused and declared he would much prefer to remain at home. Once everyone had started, Poirot got to work. He reminded me of an intelligent terrier. I believe that there was no corner of the house that he left unsearched, yet it was all done so quietly and methodically that no attention was directed to his movements. Clearly, at the end, he remained unsatisfied. We had tea on the terrace with Miss Saunders, who had not been included in the party. "The boys will enjoy it," she murmured in her faded way, "though I hope they will behave nicely, and not damage the flower beds, or go near the bees." Poirot paused in the very act of drinking. He looked like a man who has seen a ghost. "Bees?" he demanded in a voice of thunder. "Yes, Poirot, bees. 3 hives. Lady Claygate is very proud of her bees." "Bees?" cried Poirot again. Then he sprang from the table and walked up and down the terrace with his hands to his head. I could not imagine why the little man should be so agitated at the mere mention of bees. At that moment we heard the car returning. Poirot was on the doorstep as the party alighted. "Ronald's been stung," cried Gerald excitedly. "It's nothing," said Mrs. Lemesurier. "It hasn't even swollen. We put ammonia on it." "Let me see, my little man," said Poirot. "Where was it?" "Here, on the side of my neck," said Ronald importantly. "But it doesn't hurt," father said. "Keep still, there's a bee on you." And I kept still, and he took it off, but it stung me first, though it didn't really hurt. Only like a pin, and I didn't cry, because I'm so big and going to school next year. Poirot examined the child's neck, then drew away again. He took me by the arm and murmured, "Tonight, mon ami, tonight we have a little affair on. Say nothing, to anyone." He refused to be more communicative, and I went through the evening devoured by curiosity. He retired early and I followed his example. As we went upstairs, he caught me by the arm and delivered his instructions: "Do not undress. Wait a sufficient time, extinguish your light and join me here." I obeyed, and found him waiting for me when the time came. He enjoined silence on me with a gesture, and we crept quietly along the nursery wing. Ronald occupied a small room of his own. We entered it and took up our position in the darkest corner. The child's breathing sounded heavy and undisturbed. "Surely he is sleeping very heavily?" I whispered. Poirot nodded. "Drugged," he murmured. "Why?" "So that he should not cry out at what?" I asked, as Poirot paused. "At the prick of the hypodermic needle, mon ami." "Hush, let us speak no more, not that I expect anything to happen for some time." But in this Poirot was wrong. Hardly 10 minutes had elapsed before the door opened softly, and someone entered the room. I heard a sound of quick hurried breathing. Footsteps moved to the bed, and then there was a sudden click. The light of a little electric lantern fell on the sleeping child. The holder of it was still invisible in the shadow. The figure laid down the lantern. With the right hand it brought forth a syringe, with the left it touched the boy's neck. Poirot and I sprang at the same minute. The lantern rolled to the floor, and we struggled with the intruder in the dark. His strength was extraordinary. At last we overcame him. "The light, Hastings, I must see his face, though I fear I know only too well whose face it will be." So did I thought as I groped for the lantern. For a moment I had suspected the secretary, egged on by my secret dislike of the man, but I felt assured by now that the man who stood to gain by the death of his 2 childish cousins was the monster we were tracking. My foot struck against the lantern. I picked it up and switched on the light. It shone full on the face of Hugo Lemesurier, the boy's father. The lantern almost dropped from my hand. "Impossible," I murmured hoarsely. "Impossible." Lemesurier was unconscious. Poirot and I between us carried him to his room and laid him on the bed. Poirot bent and gently extricated something from his right hand. He showed it to me. It was a hypodermic syringe. I shuddered. What is in it? Poison? Formic acid, I fancy. Formic acid? Yes. Probably obtained by distilling ants. He was a chemist, you remember. Death would have been attributed to the bee sting. My God, I muttered. His own son. And you expected this? Poirot nodded gravely. Yes. He is insane, of course. I imagine that the family history has become a mania with him. His intense longing to succeed to the estate led him to commit the long series of crimes. Possibly the idea occurred to him first when traveling north that night with Vincent. He couldn't bear the prediction to be falsified. Ronald's son was already dead, and Ronald himself was a dying man. They are a weakly lot. He arranged the accident to the gun, and, which I did not suspect until now, contrived the death of his brother John by this same method of injecting formic acid into the jugular vein. His ambition was realized then. And he became the master of the family acres. But his triumph was short-lived. He found that he was suffering from an incurable disease, and he had the madman's fixed idea: the eldest son of a Lemesurier could not inherit. I suspect that the bathing accident was due to him. He encouraged the child to go out too far. That failing, he sawed through the ivy, and afterwards poisoned the child's food. Diabolical. I murmured with a shiver. And so cleverly planned. Yes, mon ami, there is nothing more amazing than the extraordinary sanity of the insane. Unless it is the extraordinary eccentricity of the sane. I imagine that it is only lately that he has completely gone over the borderline. There was method in his madness to begin with, and to think that I suspected Roger, that splendid fellow. It was the natural assumption, mon ami. We knew that he also traveled north with Vincent that night. We knew, too, that he was the next heir after Hugo and Hugo's children. But our assumption was not borne out by the facts. The ivy was sawn through when only little Ronald was at home, but it would be to Roger's interest that both children should perish. In the same way, it was only Ronald's food that was poisoned. And today when they came home and I found that there was only his father's word for it that Ronald had been stung, I remembered the other death from a wasp's sting, and I knew. Hugo Lemesurier died a few months later in the private asylum to which he was removed. His widow was remarried a year later to Mr. John Gardiner, the auburn-haired secretary. Ronald inherited the broad acres of his father, and continues to flourish. Well, I remarked to Poirot. Another illusion gone. You have disposed very successfully of the curse of the Lemesuriers. I wonder, said Poirot very thoughtfully. I wonder very much indeed. What do you mean? Mon ami, I will answer you with one significant word: red. Blood? I queried, dropping my voice to an awe-stricken whisper. Always you have the imagination melodramatic, Hastings. I refer to something much more prosaic, the color of little Ronald Lemesurier's hair. The lost mine. I laid down my bank book with a sigh. It is a curious thing, I observed, but my overdraft never seems to grow any less. And it perturbs you not? Me, if I had an overdraft, never should I close my eyes all night, declared Poirot. You deal in comfortable balances, I suppose. I retorted. £444, 4 and 4 pence, said Poirot with some complacency. A neat figure, is it not? It must be tact on the part of your bank manager. He is evidently acquainted with your passion for symmetrical details. What about investing, say, 300 of it in the porcupine oil fields? Their prospectus, which is advertised in the papers today, says that they will pay 100% dividends next year. Not for me, said Poirot, shaking his head. I like not the sensational. For me the safe, the prudent investment, less rent, the consols, the, how do you call it, the conversion. Have you never made a speculative investment? No, mon ami, replied Poirot severely. I have not. And the only shares I own which have not what you call the gilded edge are 14,000 shares in the Burma Mines Limited. Poirot paused with an air of waiting to be encouraged to go on. Yes? I prompted, and for them I paid no cash, no, they were the reward of the exercise of my little grey cells. You would like to hear the story? Yes? Of course I would. These mines are situated in the interior of Burma about 200 miles inland from Rangoon. They were discovered by the Chinese in the 15th century and worked down to the time of the Mohammedan rebellion, being finally abandoned in the year 1868. The Chinese extracted the rich lead silver ore from the upper part of the ore body, smelting it for the silver alone, and leaving large quantities of rich lead-bearing slag. This, of course, was soon discovered when prospecting work was carried out in Burma, but owing to the fact that the old workings had become full of loose filling and water, all attempts to find the source of the ore proved fruitless. Many parties were sent out by syndicates, and they dug over a large area, but this rich prize still eluded them. But a representative of one of the syndicates got on the track of a Chinese family who were supposed to have still kept a record of the situation of the mine. The present head of the family was one Wu Ling. What a fascinating page of commercial romance! I exclaimed, is it not? Ah, mon ami, one can have romance without golden-haired girls of matchless beauty. No, I am wrong, it is auburn hair that so excites you always. You remember, go on with the story, I said hastily. Eh bien, my friend, this Wu Ling was approached. He was an estimable merchant, much respected in the province where he lived. He admitted at once that he owned the documents in question, and was perfectly prepared to negotiate for this sale, but he objected to dealing with anyone other than principals. Finally it was arranged that he should journey to England and meet the directors of an important company. Wu Ling made the journey to England in the SS Assunta, and the Assunta docked at Southampton on a cold, foggy morning in November. One of the directors, Mr. Pearson, went down to Southampton to meet the boat, but owing to the fog, the train down was very much delayed, and by the time he arrived, Wu Ling had disembarked and left by special train for London. Mr. Pearson returned to town somewhat annoyed, as he had no idea where the Chinaman proposed to stay. Later in the day, however, the offices of the company were rung up on the telephone. Wu Ling was staying at the Russell Square Hotel. He was feeling somewhat unwell after the voyage, but declared himself perfectly able to attend the board meeting on the following day. The meeting of the board took place at 11 o'clock. When 11:30 came, and Wu Ling had not put in an appearance, the secretary rang up the Russell Hotel. In answer to his inquiries, he was told that the Chinaman had gone out with a friend about 10:30. It seemed clear that he had started out with the intention of coming to the meeting, but the morning wore away, and he did not appear. It was, of course, possible that he had lost his way, being unacquainted with London, but at a late hour that night he had not returned to the hotel. Thoroughly alarmed now, Mr. Pearson put matters in the hands of the police. On the following day, there was still no trace of the missing man, but towards evening of the day after that again, a body was found in the Thames which proved to be that of the ill-fated Chinaman. Neither on the body, nor in the luggage at the hotel, was there any trace of the papers relating to the mine. At this juncture, mon ami, I was brought into the affair. Mr. Pearson called upon me. While profoundly shocked by the death of Wu Ling, His chief anxiety was to recover the papers which were the object of the Chinaman's visit to England. The main anxiety of the police, of course, would be to track down the murderer. The recovery of the papers would be a secondary consideration. What he wanted me to do was to cooperate with the police while acting in the interests of the company. I consented readily enough. It was clear that there were two fields of search open to me. On the one hand, I might look among the employees of the company who knew of the Chinaman's coming, on the other, among the passengers on the boat who might have been acquainted with his mission. I started with the second, as being a narrower field of search. In this I coincided with Inspector Miller, who was in charge of the case, a man altogether different from our friend Jap, conceited, ill-mannered and quite insufferable. Together we interviewed the officers of the ship. They had little to tell us. Wu Ling had kept much to himself on the voyage. He had been intimate with but two of the other passengers, one a broken-down European named Dyer who appeared to bear a somewhat unsavory reputation, the other a young bank clerk named Charles Lester, who was returning from Hong Kong. We were lucky enough to obtain snapshots of both these men. At the moment there seemed little doubt that if either of the two was implicated, Dyer was the man. He was known to be mixed up with a gang of Chinese crooks, and was altogether a most likely suspect. Our next step was to visit the Russell Square Hotel. Shown a snapshot of Wu Ling, they recognized him at once. We then showed them the snapshot of Dyer, but to our disappointment, the hall porter declared positively that that was not the man who had come to the hotel on the fatal morning. Almost as an afterthought, I produced the photograph of Lester, and to my surprise the man at once recognized it. "Yes, sir," he asserted, "that's the gentleman who came in at 10:30 and asked for Mr. Wu Ling, and afterwards went out with him." The affair was progressing. Our next move was to interview Mr. Charles Lester. He met us with the utmost frankness, was desolated to hear of the Chinaman's untimely death, and put himself at our disposal in every way. His story was as follows: by arrangement with Wu Ling, he called for him at the hotel at 10:30. Wu Ling, however, did not appear. Instead, his servant came, explained that his master had had to go out, and offered to conduct the young man to where his master now was. Suspecting nothing, Lester agreed, and the Chinaman procured a taxi. They drove for some time in the direction of the docks. Suddenly becoming mistrustful, Lester stopped the taxi and got out, disregarding the servant's protests. That, he assured us, was all he knew. Apparently satisfied, we thanked him and took our leave. His story was soon proved to be a somewhat inaccurate one. To begin with, Wu Ling had had no servant with him either on the boat or at the hotel. In the second place, the taxi driver who had driven the two men on that morning came forward. Far from Lester's having left the taxi en route, he and the Chinese gentleman had driven to a certain unsavory dwelling place in Limehouse, right in the heart of Chinatown. The place in question was more or less well known as an opium den of the lowest description. The two gentlemen had gone in. About an hour later the English gentleman, whom he identified from the photograph, came out alone. He looked very pale and ill, and directed the taxi man to take him to the nearest underground station. Inquiries were made about Charles Lester's standing, and it was found that, though bearing an excellent character, he was heavily in debt, and had a secret passion for gambling. Dyer, of course, was not lost sight of. It seemed just faintly possible that he might have impersonated the other man, but that idea was proved utterly groundless. His alibi for the whole of the day in question was absolutely unimpeachable. Of course, the proprietor of the opium den denied everything with oriental stolidity. He had never seen Charles Lester. No two gentlemen had been to the place that morning. In any case, the police were wrong. no opium was ever smoked there. His denials, however well meant, did little to help Charles Lester. He was arrested for the murder of Wu Ling. A search of his effects was made, but no papers relating to the mine were discovered. The proprietor of the opium den was also taken into custody, but a cursory raid of his premises yielded nothing. Not even a stick of opium rewarded the zeal of the police. In the meantime, my friend Mr. Pearson was in a great state of agitation. He strode up and down my room, uttering great lamentations. "But you must have some ideas, M. Poirot," he kept urging. "Surely you must have some ideas." "Certainly I have ideas," I replied cautiously. "That is the trouble, one has too many, therefore they all lead in different directions." "For instance?" he suggested. "For instance, the taxi driver. We have only his word for it that he drove the two men to that house. That is one idea." "Then, was it really that house they went to?" "Supposing that they left the taxi there, passed through the house and out by another entrance and went elsewhere?" Mr. Pearson seemed struck by that. "But you do nothing but sit and think? Can't we do something?" He was of an impatient temperament, you comprehend. "Monsieur," I said with dignity, "it is not for Hercule Poirot to run up and down the evil-smelling streets of Limehouse like a little dog of no breeding. Be calm. My agents are at work." On the following day I had news for him. The two men had indeed passed through the house in question, but their real objective was a small eating-house close to the river. They were seen to pass in there, and Lester came out alone. And then, figure to yourself, Hastings, an idea of the most unreasonable seized this Mr. Pearson. Nothing would suit him but that we should go ourselves to this eating-house and make investigations. I argued and prayed, but he would not listen. He talked of disguising himself, he even suggested that I hesitate to say it, should shave off my mustache. Yes, rein kca. I pointed out to him that was an idea ridiculous and absurd. One destroys not a thing of beauty wantonly. Besides, shall not a Belgian gentleman with a mustache desire to see life and smoke opium just as readily as one without a mustache? Eh bien, he gave in on that, but he still insisted on his project. He turned up that evening, mon Dieu, what a figure! He wore what he called the pea jacket, his chin, it was dirty and unshaved, he had a scarf of the vilest that offended the nose. And figure to yourself, he was enjoying himself. Truly, the English are mad. He made some changes in my own appearance. I permitted it. Can one argue with a maniac? We started out. After all, could I let him go alone, a child dressed up to act the charades? Of course you couldn't, I replied. To continue, we arrived. Mr. Pearson talked English of the strangest. He represented himself to be a man of the sea. He talked of lubbers and foxels and I know not what. It was a low little room with many Chinese in it. We ate of peculiar dishes, Dieu, mon estomac. Poirot clasped that portion of his anatomy before continuing. Then there came to us the proprietor, a Chinaman with a face of evil smiles. You gentlemen no likey food here, he said. You come for what you likey better. Picey pipe, eh? Mr. Pearson, he gave me the great kick under the table, he had on the boots of the sea too. And he said, I don't mind if I do, John. Let ahead. The Chinaman smiled, and he took us through a door and to a cellar and through a trapdoor, and down some steps and up again into a room all full of divans and cushions of the most comfortable. We lay down and a Chinese boy took off our boots. It was the best moment of the evening. Then they brought us the opium pipes and cooked the opium pills, and we pretended to smoke and then to sleep and dream. But when we were alone, Mr. Pearson called softly to me, and immediately he began crawling along the floor. We went into another room where other people were asleep, and so on, until we heard two men talking. We stayed behind a curtain and listened. They were speaking of Wu Ling. "What about the papers?" said one. "Mr. Lester, he take those," answered the other, who was a Chinaman. "He say, put them all in Safi place, where policemen no looky." "Ah, but he's nabbed," said the first one. "He get tea free. Policeman not sure he done it." There was more of the same kind of thing. Then apparently the two men were coming our way, and we scuttled back to our beds. "We'd better get out of here," said Pearson, after a few minutes had elapsed. "This place isn't healthy." "You are right, monsieur," I agreed. "We have played the farce long enough. We succeeded in getting away, all right, paying handsomely for our smoke." Once clear of Limehouse, Pearson drew a long breath. "I'm glad to get out of that," he said. "But it's something to be sure." "It is indeed," I agreed. "And I fancy that we shall not have much difficulty in finding what we want, after this evening's masquerade." "And there was no difficulty whatsoever," finished Poirot suddenly. This abrupt ending seemed so extraordinary that I stared at him. But where were they?" I asked. "In his pocket, tout simplement." "But in whose pocket?" "Mr. Pearson's, parbleu." Then, observing my look of bewilderment, he continued gently, "You do not yet see it? Mr. Pearson, like Charles Lester, was in debt. Mr. Pearson, like Charles Lester, was fond of gambling. And he conceived the idea of stealing the papers from the Chinaman. He met him all right at Southampton, came up to London with him, and took him straight to Limehouse. It was foggy that day. The Chinaman would not notice where he was going. I fancy Mr. Pearson smoked the opium fairly often down there and had some peculiar friends in consequence. I do not think he meant murder. His idea was that one of the Chinamen should impersonate Wu Ling and receive the money for the sale of the document. So far, so good. But, to the Oriental mind, it was infinitely simpler to kill Wu Ling and throw his body into the river, and Pearson's Chinese accomplices followed their own methods without consulting him. Imagine, then, what you would call the funk blue of M. Pearson. Someone may have seen him in the train with Wu Ling. Murder is a very different thing from simple abduction. His salvation lies with the Chinaman who is personating Wu Ling at the Russell Square Hotel. If only the body is not discovered too soon. Probably Wu Ling had told him of the arrangement between him and Charles Lester whereby the latter was to call for him at the hotel. Pearson sees there an excellent way of diverting suspicion from himself. Charles Lester shall be the last person to be seen in company with Wu Ling. The impersonator has orders to represent himself to Lester as the servant of Wu Ling, and to bring him as speedily as possible to Limehouse. There, very likely, he was offered a drink. The drink would be suitably drugged, and when Lester emerged an hour later, he would have a very hazy impression of what had happened. So much was this the case, that as soon as Lester learned of Wu Ling's death, he loses his nerve, and denies that he ever reached Limehouse. By that, of course, he plays right into Pearson's hands. But is Pearson content? No, my manner disquiets him. And he determines to complete the case against Lester. So he arranges an elaborate masquerade. Me, I am to be gulled completely. Did I not say just now that he was as a child acting the charades? Eh bien, I play my part. He goes home rejoicing. But in the morning, Inspector Miller arrives on his doorstep. the papers are found on him, the game is up. Bitterly he regrets permitting himself to play the farce with Hercule Poirot. There was only one real difficulty in the affair. What was that? I demanded curiously. Convincing Inspector Miller. What an animal, that! Both obstinate and imbecile, and in the end he took all the credit. Too bad, I cried. Ah, well. I had my compensations. The other directors of the Burma Mines Ltd. awarded me 14,000 shares as a small recompense for my services. Not so bad, eh? But when investing money, keep, I beg of you, Hastings, strictly to the conservative. The things you read in the paper, they may not be true. The directors of the Porcupine, they may be so many Mr. Pearsons.